into the right space. I think this is a great complement to the plenary program we just had. I thought that was fascinating lens on city building. I think with this panel and with this panel discussion, and I'm also wanting to make the point that I think this panel discussion will lend itself to your participation even more than most. I think and you'll see, I think, quickly why that's the case. So we're hoping that you'll get yourself, as we do the front end here, ready to engage deeply with this conversation. It's an early stage conversation. One thing that I've noticed in just looking through and doing some research on this topic is that the world has barely scratched the surface on this topic. And in having some earlier conversations with the panel, I think you're gonna see we're gonna do a pretty good job of scratching the surface. But nonetheless, it's still a very unexplored topic. You think about how fast innovations are jumping on us. The 5 years ago sort of didn't really know what the smartphone was going to do, and here it is, and it kind of overwhelmed us and caught up to us very quickly. Well, here's one that is perhaps we are anticipating a little more proactively, but nonetheless still are scratching the surface as to what even that proactive opportunity allows us in terms of anticipating. So I think this is truly a topic du jour. So I'm going to introduce the panel, and what we're also going to do is we're going to do a little front-end presentation to help people understand, get a base level of understanding of what are the fundamentals of what is meant by the driverless car. In having a number of conversations, it actually surprised me how many people didn't really quite understand what was even meant, and it even came up on the panel discussion this morning about the daughter of one of the panelists thinking that the vehicle was going to be waiting for her outside of the Loblaws. I mean, that's the sort of level of set that we want to sort of maybe bring the conversation up to so people understand what we're talking about, but then turn the conversation very decidedly towards its city building implications. This is not a technology panel. This is a city building panel, so that will be our focus. All right, so I will introduce first the panel, and then I'll introduce our presenter and who will in turn become a panelist. So very pleased, and again, as per all of these bios, we're expecting people to use the app or go online to get the more full, complete bio details so that we can move along fairly quickly. So with apologies for the brief introductions, I will just mention your name and your firms. So Antonio Gomez Palacio is a principal at Planning and Urban Design of Planning and Urban Design at Dialogue, a very, very great firm, one that I believe Jennifer Keesmaat was most recently at, so one with great pedigree. Jeremy McMillan, who's president of Design Corp International, and Gianpaolo Pugliese, missed it. Say it for me.
Pugliese.
Thank you. I had it. At principal at Audix Architecture. Wonderful pre-discussions we've had, so this is going to be a great conversation. But first, I'm going to bring up Stuart Sherman, who's the Chief Executive Officer of IMC, who's going to give us a sort of a fun, light, but important level set on what is meant by driverless technology, and I will turn it to you, Stuart.
Sure. Thank you. So the purpose of this is not because we assume you don't know what it is. It's just to try to create some common lexicon. And one of the challenges with technology in general is that when we think of technology, we tend to think of tactics, and really it's more about philosophy. And so, just for lexical purposes, what is a driverless car? So they're called uncrewed vehicles, driverless, self-driving, robotic cars. They have all sorts of names, but fundamentally, really what it is it's a vehicle that's designed to travel between two destinations without a driver, a human being intervening. How they work? Well, effectively what's happening is sensory substitution. We've basically taken a computer and we've programmed it to act like a human. So it's using radar and LiDAR, which is laser-based radar, and GPSs and computer technology in order to do this. And really a form of artificial intelligence. And actually one of the places that we're seeing artificial intelligence used in practical purposes these days is really driverless cars. That's really at the forefront of AI. And the issue, though, and to get into the philosophy of it, is that they're designed with different paradigms. And as we talk about it today, I'd like everybody to be thinking about these different paradigms, because it's very important, because what you take out of it translates into how you see it and what the impact would be. So if we were going to talk about it in 3 paradigms, it seems like one of them is car ownership. So I don't know if anybody's seen the video of the new Mercedes driverless prototype, but the idea is that you've got this luxury vehicle that you'd have the luxury not to drive. And this is what they're selling. Mercedes doesn't want you to not own the vehicle, just like Tesla right now. They actually have upgrades that will actually make their cars driverless, or so they claim. They want you to buy the car. And so this is paradigm number 1. And I suspect, looking at Marshall McLuhan, every new media emulates the one that came before it. There's also a term that we like to use in our industry or in our company, which we call intellectual inertia, which is that we tend to like to think the way we've always thought. So if you're a car manufacturer, you want to sell cars. So you don't want to switch to the 2nd model or the 3rd model. The 2nd model is cars for hire. So this is where Uber is going, where they're doing work right now, or they've announced that they're doing work with driverless cars. And Google has said that they're going to come up with the Google Taxi, which they're trying in New York City. And there's probably implications for Zipcar and other companies like that. And that's the idea that you never need to own a car, which falls more around the millennial model of don't need a car, will get a car when I need a car, but don't need to own a car. And so that's a very different model again. And then the last one is a hybrid model. And hybrid models, I find, when we start looking at technology, become the most interesting. I would argue that Airbnb is a hybrid model. I own the place, but I also rent it out. The hybrid model for this could be I drive my car to work because it's parked in my driveway and I recharge it because it's probably electric. But while I'm working, my car's working too and going and picking up people and making me some extra cash, helping to pay itself off or whatever it does. I think that these 3 models will probably all exist. And I think one of the more important things to think about is that as technology happens, we look at it and say, in 1859, Watt invented the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution happened. Well, it didn't really happen like that, and we kind of all know that. So the driverless car is not going to just happen like that. There will still be typical cars on the road. I still drive stick. It's hard to buy a car that's stick these days. It's just the way things go, where there is some inertia for old models as well. So when we talk about this, just in summary, the question of who wins in this battle of the three paradigms, I think that the answer is that it's really hard to predict. It'll probably be a hybridized model. And one thing's for certain, that they won't all be driverless on the same day. So we're going to see all sorts of pressures associated with that, and that's quite normal. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for using all the images I picked out for you. I appreciate it. Let me just ask, before we go into conversation, because I think it is important that if there's any confusion on what it is we're talking about as a basic technology platform without getting too techie, does anybody have any questions of Stuart, just in terms of what it is that's coming at us? Okay, very good. All right. This is going to be a good question, too. Here we go.
One of the questions on just what the technology is there are some videos out there showing that we get to a world where the driverless cars and every pedestrian, every car, every deer has to have a GPS on it so that everybody can talk to each other. How important is it? Is the industry headed towards this idea that the cars are actually talking to each other, or what you described was more just
Well, so I think that the answer really has a couple of problems with it. To give you the answer, if I was going to predict forward based on the best predictor of future behavior is past and present behavior, I have an iPhone, and my iPhone can iMessage anybody here in this room who has an iPhone. Unfortunately, if you have an Android, I can't iMessage you. So I think one of the things that we're going to see, but we can all SMS each other. We can all text each other. So I think one of the things we're going to see is that there's going to be a battle. And the battle will eventually start to coalesce into factions or groups. And we'll start to see stuff happening. So what you're talking about is cooperative. And there's a huge case for cooperative where they talk about drafting on the highway and even self-charging highways and that kind of stuff. And it's quite brilliant. We're just not there. And I think there'll be a lot of battles over how they do it. Because just if we take a look at the way Tesla, the way Google, and the way Mercedes have implemented driverless technology, the systems are entirely different. They rely on slightly different technology underlying it. And then if you had to make the leap in saying, okay, I need my Google car to talk to my Mercedes, somebody has to create a standard. Everybody's got to agree. So yes, probably, one day, not soon. How's that for an answer?
Still doesn't say whether we have to get all the deer.
Oh, well, that's the Internet of Things, and that's a separate question. But I think that the answer would be that we're moving closer and closer to the Internet of Things, where everything will actually be connected to the Internet, and you'll be able to sense it. A strange story: our latest client trucks human feces. It sounds strange, but we're putting things in the trucks to know how much stuff is in the truck. They take it from waste recycling plants, which are owned by municipalities, and they spread it on farmers' fields. And they're interested, where's the truck? How late is the truck in traffic? How loaded is the truck? All of this stuff. So when you start looking at it that way, you can start saying that, yes, all things will one day be connected if perfume wagons are connected.
Okay, so I'm not sure if that's the perfect segue. But I will now move to our panel, and let's start with a very basic question, maybe for each of you. What do you see, on the surface in particular, and we'll go deeper, but on the surface, what do you see as the most basic implications of these kinds of driverless technologies heading our way? And you can speak to, or if both scales, if you might, but from a building level, but also to a larger precinct or city building scale, if you could, just sort of the most obvious. And we have lots of time to go into depth, so give us the things that we think are probably.
I think one of the most obvious and most fascinating things. I mean, to me, I was overcome with this euphoria thinking about this utopian reality of these cars merging and fluidly traveling and creating space for green in cities. And one thought that I had was, given a 90% adoption rate of this kind of technology, parking will change. This major blight in our urban environments will take on a different character. Maybe they'll be industrialized spaces which won't require ventilation or human inhabitation, so there'll be different kind of depots perhaps, and maybe more remote. So this, we imagine, could free up land for development, and we had this discussion earlier about potential for green space, and when we think about the profit motive of most developers, they're reluctant to give up this space for green, obviously making deals with city officials and so on to have this. But at least the face of parking structures will change, and this is a huge blight. I was in Pittsburgh recently, and you walk down the street, being one of the only people walking down the street, actually, and you're confronted with these horrendous buildings, these garish parking structures, all in decay. Nobody wants to maintain them or spend money on them. So these may be buried in larger blocks and more hidden. They may be remote, and this, I think, will liberate cities from one of the most obvious blights that I've experienced in my adult life. That's my thought.
Perfect.
Can I jump in there? I think I can maybe elaborate on that same idea. I think the implication stems primarily from what Stuart laid out at the beginning in where the future of this technology is going to take us. So if on one hand, ownership of vehicles remains the status quo, then the storage of those vehicles will remain a requirement as well. And the proximate storage of those vehicles, because it's an on-demand sort of technology. So even though you may not park it in the building that you're at, you want it nearby. So you still need to store the cars.
In the ownership model.
In the ownership model, correct. And even under your scenario, if you're renting your car, you still need to, you own it, so you're going to put it somewhere. And you're going to want it when you want it, right? So there's that. The other side is car for hire, where you're basically a complete autonomous rental car, if you will, shared vehicle. In which case, it's like Colin mentioned earlier with his daughter, you'd get dropped off, and then another car would come pick you up after you finish at your destination. More likely than not, we will see a hybrid of these two. The question is the degree to which either of those two scenarios is more predominant or not. And that will affect, I think, the built environment, the degree to which either of those scenarios is the case. So ultimately, what ends up happening is the storage of the vehicle becomes the thing that affects land use. And I'm just going to make one more point. We can talk about it later. And I'd like to break it down into two scenarios, or two sort of camps. We need to look at privately owned land different from publicly owned land. So in the private sector, you have a private owner that owns property with a large inventory of parking stalls. They're going to use that purely based on a profit motive, which is fine. They're going to develop it to the highest and best use. Where the opportunity lies, I think, is in the public realm, where we are currently using huge resources of public land to store vehicles through on-street parking, public parking, and then the actual right-of-ways themselves, I think, are wider than they probably would need to be if we had the technology. So there's going to be a lot of land that's freed up that, as a community, we will have the opportunity to decide how that's used, and that, I think, there may be opportunity. The space between the buildings.
Tony?
Sure. Well, I was telling my wife last night that this is the first time that I've been on the panel where none of us know anything about this, because we're all speculating at what the impact is going to be. But I'll do a quick test. So, show of hands, who has a wristwatch? So, maybe half of the room. If we have done this 10 years ago, everybody in the room would have lifted up their hands, right? Again, show of hands in the last month, who has used some kind of a shared vehicle? So AutoShare, Zipcar, or Uber. So half of them, right? So my sense is what this is going to do is it's going to break down what were formerly polarized systems, right? And what I mean by that is there's a lot of things that in how we operate and that are going to start to have a gap in between them filled up. So whereas before you either had to own a car or you were a transit user, now in fact there's a huge array of options somewhere in between, right? You can choose not to own a car and still have exactly all of those pieces. And we focus very much around the individual being transported on a vehicle, but if we take this to its ultimate consequences, it actually affects everything that is being transported, right? So goods movement is going to be a huge exercise in terms of understanding what automating transportation is going to mean, right? We heard this morning about automating and Fort McMurray, some of the systems there, but getting a banana coming from across the world is all of a sudden going to be a very different exercise. Your kids going to school, if they're being bused, is going to be a very different exercise, right? Getting all of those things being moved around. The cost of transportation is very much linked to the cost of a individual who is driving the bus. The scale of that bus is very much based on the scale of making those systems efficient. So all of a sudden you can break all of that up and fill in the gap between those polarized. Either you have a big truck or you don't have a big truck at all, right? Either you're trying to solve a right-of-way design street that accommodates that big truck, or you don't do it all. Now there's a lot of options in between. So parking is one of the ones that we immediately focus on, but there's a lot of things in addition to that. You know, I fear to imagine what we're going to turn drop-offs and pickups like, right? All of a sudden, every building at 5 o'clock, office building at 5 o'clock is going to look like a school zone, right? With a lot of people coming in and out and having their cars being picked up. But ultimately, what this is going to start to do is it's going to create a lot of options in terms of how we conduct our day-to-day lives. You don't need to have a watch, and you can still tell the time. You can have a lot of options, which means that when we're designing the city, when we're designing, taking on developments, when we're doing these kinds of things, we're not going to be stuck to the ordinary paradigm. We can now design buildings with zero parking. We can now design service and loading areas that are going to start to accommodate small vehicles, right? We can start to think about very different ways of doing things, and it's going to hugely affect the design and the design process.
So I want to go down the urban implication a little bit further and then turn to a suburban. But I want to ask Stuart first. One of the premises, or one of the things that I guess we have to sort out a little bit is where we see the preponderance of those models you showed us. And you know, it's been pointed out to me that the costs, at least in the first probably decades, but many years anyway, so the cost of the individual electric automated car, probably electric, is probably going to be really high. Ownership is almost, by pure economics, is probably going to drive it to be more of a shared kind of model than not. But could you speak to that? And then I'd like to get from the panel, again, from an urban implication. You've all touched on it, especially around the reduction of parking. But I want to have you paint a picture of what that might mean a little more clearly in terms of how we see an inner city or a more urban fabric change as a result of that opportunity. But do you want to comment first on that?
Absolutely. Well, so I think that if we look at it from a cost standpoint, I would say the cost will be relatively high. If you take a look at the new models of car made by Infiniti and a number of other kind of slightly sub-luxury brands, they're actually capable of a lot of the drive-yourself features. They do auto braking, they'll give you lane departure warning and that kind of stuff, all for about $60,000. Now, that's either quite affordable or that's impossible, depending on who you are, where you live, how much you earn. And so I think that we're going to see that impacting a lot of things because adoption will start with people who are more affluent, obviously, because people who are less affluent are not going to go out and buy a new $60,000 car. So that'll be a piece. The other piece, which is on the other side of it and quite related, is real estate is incredibly expensive. Technology is seen as quite disposable. So we all get the new iPhone every year or whatever it is. Maybe not all of us, maybe just me and my friends. But the idea being that real estate being much more enduring creates much more cost for the gamble itself. So if you thought about it for a parking lot for self-driving cars, well, right now a parking lot has to have a roof height high enough for a 6-foot-something person to be able to walk in. But if your average car is only about 4.5 feet high, you could actually get two sets of parking if the car could drive in itself and come out itself in about a 10-foot space. So if you start looking at it that way, the questions will be cost gambles on both sides. And how will things react to that? And as those cost gambles get played out, I think that we'll start to see adoption.
So, ownership or not, but I'm going to take the assumption, at least in the early days, that there's going to be less need for ownership, at least less need for immediate proximity to parking. Let's go down the panel here, and what in an urban context? Give us sort of a sense of that picture. That, you know, give maybe the good, the bad, the ugly. What are the things that we think could be very positive? What are the things we might want to maybe be concerned about?
I like the notion that you just mentioned about the clustering of the arrival at the arrival point, and this will change our perception of our needs and requirements in architecture and how we perceive buildings. I mean, it may be the return of the front door, you know. how we're experiencing buildings differently now. So, I mean, I think it possibly in residential architecture we'll see the return of the porte cochere. You know, I mean, there are these are fantastical machinations of imagination. But I can see, you know, when Frank went right to the Roby House in 1908, he predicted the advent of the automobile. We put the three-car garage in the Roby House in 1908. And then became obsessed with the automobile and used the ramp design for the Guggenheim and so on. So these things do influence our perception of architecture, and they do inspire the creators of that. So I think the front door experience will really change.
I actually think, again, all of this is speculative, but in a way, this technology offers an opportunity to kind of bring us back to an older way of building to some degree, because if you look at a lot of the urban centers that we love, many of them were laid out and they're building the plots of land, and the building typologies and their structures were established, you know, over 100 years ago, at which time car use was not prevalent. So if indeed, even if we do still own our cars, I think there's going to be a separation between the title of your parking and the title of your domicile or workplace. I don't think they will continue to need to be adjacent to each other or tied together. So you could lease an office space and lease your parking space completely independently, which you already can now, but in many models of real estate, they kind of come with, and there's sort of an incentive. Same with your housing, comes with a parking or without a parking, and it's hard to sort of sell off your parking spot under certain scenarios. So that being said, as soon as you separate the two, then buildings can exist without parking. And once you do that, then the building form can go back to a more human sort of oriented structure. When we build buildings today that have parking, basically everything on the ground floor is governed by the exigencies of the car, primarily because they take up more space. So when you're doing, you know, a condo, for example, with some retail, you're always looking at, okay, where's the vehicular access to that building? How do you get in? How do you ramp down? And how do you circulate around a structure? That structure then dictates the structure above, which dictates the suite layouts and so on and so forth. The position of the elevator core vis-a-vis the loading,
Right.
all of that stuff. So it'll give us an opportunity to sort of completely reimagine that. But in a way, I would imagine we're going to, well, we have new ways of building, obviously, but I think a more street front kind of experience will be more prevalent, I suspect.
Tony?
Sure. And you asked specifically, what is the implication to the urban environment?
Or we'll get to suburban in a second.
Yeah. But, you know, though driverless cars is, you know, new and disruptive technology to a certain extent, it also forms part of a trend. And the trend that I would point the finger at is that of a shared economy, right? And so if you see it in that context, the urban implication is we're quickly moving away from environments where you need to own everything to environments where you're really focused on sharing a lot of aspects of your day-to-day life. So what does that mean? It means I don't need a 2-car garage on a 1-acre lot, single-family detached. Now I can have a micro residential condo, right, where I'm sharing everything from a workshop that I want. I can, you know, kind of share that with somebody else. You know, my public spaces, my transportation systems, all of these kinds of things. So we're quickly moving from single land use on lower densities to higher land densities in mixed environments where there's a renewed emphasis on the public realm, and a public realm that is actually being delivered through private systems, which is fascinating. So for the first time in the last several years, we have now policies around POPs, right? Privately owned, publicly accessible open spaces, right? A whole number of these environments. So really kind of that millennial dream of being able to live in an environment that is complex, it's vibrant, it's rich, is being delivered by a whole bunch of these different systems. And I saw a recent poll asking people, would you rather own an iPhone or a car? right? And it was fascinating, but there's the older age demographics, the car by far, like that's the ticket to freedom, right? Whereas in the younger demographics, and I haven't owned a car in 18 years, it was the phone, right? Because the car is actually a burden, and the phone was, indispensable. You can't live without that. So it's really kind of that which provides options, that which provides access to the broader economy is starting to have huge ripple effects on how we plan cities, how we look at even neighborhoods, and how we even start to look at individual sites.
Okay. I said we'd only scratch the surface, and we could go a lot deeper on that. But just to keep the conversation going before we turn to the audience, and I'm going to there's beyond the surface questions that you have in your minds, I'm sure. So please get ready for them. But let's talk about the suburban aspect. I mean, I think on first blush, a lot of people see the driverless car as with the shared economy and the various reduction of the need for parking as a great urban enabler, but also, and there is a growing amount of discussion on this. It's also potentially unlocking the opportunity once again for the autonomous automobile to be the primary form of transportation. Cities like Toronto have probably seen more urbanization and intensification as a result of gridlock than any policy, green belt or growth plan that is probably really more individuals, millennials in particular, saying they don't want to be stuck in traffic. But suddenly here comes the car that allows more traffic to flow, makes being in traffic less unpleasant. Quite honestly, you can see how it could unlock the market demand for suburban sprawl all over again. How do you react to that idea? And let's go ahead, Jean. Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about that exact thing. I was actually going to make a comment. I think it all stems from what you believe drives people to want to live in an urban center, right? Are people making the choice to live downtown in these vibrant communities solely based on the fact that they don't have to commute? I think it has a huge part. It's an important part of that decision. However, I'm hopeful enough to believe that they're doing it also because of the lifestyle it affords. I'm somewhat skeptical that people will choose to say, well, I'd be willing to live 2 hours out of the city because I don't have to drive. Because you're still confined to this bubble for 2 hours of your day. So even how many newspapers can you read and how long can you go on the internet? I don't think that is necessary. I'm not too worried about that. I may be wrong because people may say, well, that's what I want to do. It's my decompression time or whatever. But I think there's more power to the human sort of spirit and relationships of a sort of an urban center. So that's why I'm kind of hopeful that it will not pan out.
Yeah,
Antonio?
my sense is that I'll differentiate between suburbs and sprawl.
Okay.
Right, sprawl being an unsustainable form of growth, right? And it's unsustainable because the cost of running it becomes higher than the value that you get out of it, right? So for a municipality, it's very expensive to have low density development. However, all of a sudden you start to have systems that start to allow the government to pull back from delivering these systems in these areas. So you no longer need to be the provider of public transit when there's an affordable form of transportation that is an alternative to car ownership. So aging in place, for example, all of a sudden becomes viable where it wouldn't through public transit or through, generally speaking. So my sense is that public transit agencies, for example, are going to start pulling back from suburban and sprawling environments, right, and focusing on mass transit because you're still going to need the subways, you're going to need the mass rapid transit, you're going to need all of these environments.
So more subways, fewer buses, or
Correct,
yeah.
like that you can pull back from the finer grain type of things, right? So busing kids to school, providing garbage, doing all of these kinds of things in lower density suddenly becomes more viable, right? What we're also seeing as a parallel trend is kind of the urbanization of a lot of these suburbs, and things that tend to be very hidden, like home occupancy and secondary units, are starting to enter some of the sprawling environments in suburbs. And all of those become further enabled by having autonomous modes of transportation. So increasingly, I can imagine that we're going to start to see kind of a hidden density emerge in many of these environments, and some of them actually become sustainable, for at least for the provision of municipal services, where they currently are not.
So I'm gonna, Stuart, I have a question for you in a second, but Jeremy, there's, our first two panelists have sort of suggested that even in a suburban, as opposed to sprawl, distinction noted, there's a likelihood or a possibility that the autonomous car will continue to allow us to densify more than not, and do you take that perspective?
Yeah, I think densification is what people like, and we heard great talk yesterday about the urbanization of suburbs and the need for authenticity, and I think that densification does offer that, and does offer us walkable environments, which I think has great appeal to most of us. When you see the removal of vast tracts of parking lots, especially surrounding shopping centers, you see and can imply that there would be future opportunities for growth, given market conditions, of course. And when we think about our trends and what we desire that densification, street scale, fine textured experiences, green, I think there'd be opportunities for that.
Fascinating. We'll get Ellen Dunham-Jones in a
Yeah,
second to ask a
that's
couple
right.
of questions.
Fire.
But Stuart, let me ask, to change it up a little bit, and I'll have one last set of questions. We've got, well, actually, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll turn to the audience after this one question for you, Stuart, because I will have about 18 minutes left, which is a healthy amount of time. What about energy in the equation here? We may be having fewer vehicles in the inventory because we don't need to store our vehicles for the 4% of the time that we would use it, the 96% of the time that we store it. But now we're having vehicles moving around a lot more. They may be electric, but there's probability for a greater amount of autonomous vehicle with the added capacity and convenience. But that means more energy needed to make that kind of a transportation model work. I don't know, if I'm asking a question you're not comfortable with, because I didn't even talk about this before, so I'm throwing you a curveball, but maybe you've given some consideration to the implications of an added amount of energy consumption that would be required.
Well, and I think that there's two forms of energy consumption. It's a great question. One of the things that is being talked about now is inductive roadways, where they actually put coils in the roadway, and as the car passes over the coils, which are electric, it basically is its own generator, and it's constantly charging the battery. Realistically, that should be the future. Factually, it's going to be so expensive to retrofit. And then when we take a look at these things, we start saying, and this is the interesting thing when you talk about it in terms of a government and a city versus an individual's choice, that the cost of putting that in would be so expensive. You'd have to rip up every road and put down new material, and how does it live in the winter and with salt and all of these problems, and maintain it. And where it doesn't work, you've got a whole set of other problems, the cars stopping at the side of the road. And so as we look at this, I think that our whole energy model and the way we look at this will change. Theoretically, cars will start moving more towards electric over time, especially as Tesla gets better at mass manufacturing batteries and things like that. The oil prices will vary and cause that to change as well. So I think that as we look at these things, that the challenge really lies in the fact of the human animal, and what the human animal is willing to accept and what the human animal is not. So when we talk about drop-off, for example, the human animal takes a certain amount of time to get in the car and get settled. If you've ever waited for somebody to pull out of a parking spot in a crowded place, you know that waiting period takes a really long time. These things are very frustrating, and I think that that'll shape stuff. The human animal will start making choices about energy as well. Like, I may not choose to park my car. I may choose to have my autonomous car just circle the block because I'm only going to be in for 10 minutes. Now, my 10 minutes turns into an hour, but my autonomous car just keeps circling the block. And when 100 of us do this, it becomes a problem, and the energy impact of that will change things. So it's almost like we need this Adam Smith invisible hand is going to start making decisions for us. And so it'll be very curious.
I want to just
ahead.
make one comment regarding that. One thing that I think it has nothing to do or sort of to detach from built form, but I think our economy and the way we deal with the paying for this infrastructure needs to be more tied to the actual use of the infrastructure. So if it actually costs you hundreds of dollars to let your car run around, wasting that energy, you won't do it. Right now, we have a very poor way of appropriating the cost of our infrastructure to those who use it. People use roads and we pay taxes, but we don't really use based on our demand. I think this technology offers the opportunity for a lot of efficiency in that, potentially, where you sort of, companies like Uber that may have a fleet of 10,000 cars in the city, they're going to pay for the use of the roads based on how the amount of use, so on and so forth. So you can really calibrate that. And I think that'll shift the whole suburban urban kind of angle, because it's no longer just the time it takes to sit. The cost to you is not just your time sitting in traffic or in the car, it's actually the use of that land to get from point A to point B. We should be paying for that. And if we calibrated that properly, I think then you get into a different sort of looking physical form to some degree.
And my sense very, very quickly is that driverless cars, to a certain extent, is a distracting topic from a bigger sustainability question, right? In terms of, is driverless car inherently greener? Well, you rarely see the conversation framed that way. There's other technologies that may come parallel to it that may make it greener, and may be a bit of a balancing exercise. It may require you building less cars, therefore greener, but those cars are going to be driving for longer hours on the road, so therefore less, right? The bigger question is still, how do we actually reduce car dependency regardless of it being, you driving or iRobot driving?
Okay, quick comment. I want to get
I'm
over.
curious about two things, two things that I've mused on. One is the change in urban advertising that may occur as we become theoretically more myopic and inward-facing in our driverless vehicles. That's one thought I had. And in São Paulo, as you know, they cleaned the entire city of any signage. It's called Cidade Limpa program. They actually pulled it off. The entire city was stripped of all signage. It was quite spectacular to witness. Perhaps this will happen. Perhaps. The other thing is vehicle design. What uses will that usurp? What architectural paradigms will that change? When we think of vehicles changing their character, perhaps their meeting rooms. When I go to São Paulo or Lima or Mexico City and have to meet somebody, it's horrendous. I mean, we waste 4 hours trying to connect. Maybe there'll be meeting vehicles that we can take from one place to another. Maybe there'll be, in São Paulo, there's a phenomenon, the motel phenomenon is huge. For people that lack privacy, they want to have an intimate moment. They go to motels, and this is a whole design phenomenon that's going on. These things are taking on these wild characters. Perhaps there'll be mobile motels.
Another perfect. We're just getting segues after another. Perfect pivot point here. So I will now turn to already many hands. Good. So I'll do them in as quick. What I'll try to do is maybe we'll get one answer, and we'll try to take in as many questions as possible. But I'll start. I'm forgetting, Councillor. You're John. Tell me, please.
Every time I hear discussions about driverless cars, I hear about people talking about, what do we do with the extra roadway width? Will this cause people to start moving from the suburbs? But is there anybody out there putting out the postulation that we can actually see greater congestion with driverless cars? And
Oh, yeah.
Think about how serious an issue that could be if this increases. I just think if the car becomes that much easier to use, I'll use it that much more.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, my 14-year-old son could have his own car because he doesn't need a license.
That's right.
Very significant challenge as opposed to this utopian opportunity that we seem to hear about. Really concerning.
Yeah, I think that with technology in general, what we tend to do is we tend to imagine what we wish. I remember being at a travel conference in the 90s, and somebody said, the internet will do for travel what the laser printer did for paper use, or the paperless office, more accurately. And I think that this is one of the challenges where we choose not to see the multiplier effect. We prefer to see the outcome that we would like. And the question is, can we envision that? And that comes down to that human-animal thing where, you know, I have 2 children who go to 2 different schools, one north, one south. That would mean 4 cars in my family would be optimum.
If I can just add, when I think about the city building and government's responsibility, I mean, we have, other communities have anti-idling bylaws. I mean, we're gonna have to put in place regulations for how long the car can serve.
Okay, I'm going to go to, I see that's you'll be number 3, but number 2 and 3, or sorry, you'll be number 4, and go ahead, sir, at the back.
Sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum then, what are we seeing in Toronto compared to other cities in the world on our decrease in reliance of parking facilities and from a planning process or from a design perspective on the development side, are we seeing a lot more applications come through without the requirement for parking? And again, where does Toronto sit relative to other cities on that?
Who wants to take that one on? Current, this is pre-autonomous vehicle.
Yes, sure. So there's already many buildings in Toronto built with 0 parking, right? Or only a few parking spots for auto shares and similars. And that is not the case in lower density cities, but it's already happening. It's also starting to happen on the office environment, right? And a lot of retail is starting to build without parking needs. So that's already a trend that is taking place, regardless of driverless or not. And it has to do very much with the quality of life aspirations.
Okay, there was a question back here still. Yes, no? Okay, it's evaporated. Now, this gentleman, yes, go ahead, sir. Maybe actually say who you are, too. I should have asked that. Could you be fairly brief? 'Cause I want to try to get as much as possible in, but sure, go ahead.
Because I'm doing some research on this topic, so.
Okay.
So I'll just make 4 or 5 points. Number 1, I'll be quick. We heard this morning that one of the main benefits of autonomous vehicles is they will dramatically increase safety, as much as 90%. And what that means is, or even more, and what that means is that the cars can be smaller and lighter. A lot of what goes into today's cars is armor to protect us. What that means is that then it'll be much easier to build electric cars and to have electric cars with a shared model because electric power sources get very big and they add a lot of weight to the vehicle. So the smaller the vehicle, the more readily it can be electric, the more readily it can be energy efficient. So
Okay.
that's all
Okay.
kind of one part. And then the second part, regarding the question about access, about growth, yes, vehicle kilometer travel will increase dramatically. There are about probably 800,000 people in Toronto today don't get to use cars very much. Young people, the elderly, people with disabilities of various kinds, and low-income people. So that will indeed drive more vehicle use, but at the same time, vehicles, smart self-driving vehicles move much more efficiently, and they'll be smarter and lighter. So those are all things.
Okay.
Now, the final point I want to make about this whole issue, what to do with that, these parking spots on the streets and encouraging active transportation. Well, one scenario is to try to turn as many of them as possible into bike lanes, which would, of course, mitigate a lot of the other effects that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you for that. Any comments on those points? All right, we will turn to some more questions. I'll start with you.
Well,
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
All break down in a snowstorm. Okay, testing it in San Francisco is one
Cars
thing.
will sense that.
Yeah,
Is that that's,
No, I'm sorry.
no.
yeah.
No,
Anybody want to comment or steer?
No, well, the premise is that it shouldn't, right? But it does, if you take it to another, expanded it, there is an ethical debate around this right now, right? So what happens when the little old lady walks in front of the driverless car? Do you does the car choose to sacrifice the passenger or the little old lady, right? The snowstorm, like add some of these dimensions. So I think extreme conditions will always raise questions about, the programmer who's putting all of this information in, and what do you do? And it's a fascinating one. Often this is the reason why it hasn't been rolled out on the streets. It's not a technological hurdle. It's actually an ethical one.
I'm just talking about functionality
Yeah.
of snow storage and how that affects sort of how the car drives itself.
Well, if you had powered roads, they could be heat traced, and you could just melt the snow.
Well, and now you can have a driverless Zamboni, right? So-
I guess I had a comment regarding the idea that this is the holy grail or this is going to open up some utopia. I don't think that is the case. I think any technology basically advances society in that it allows for more utility and more efficiency out of the resources that we have. But it doesn't change our life fundamentally, I don't think. We talk about email. Yes, okay, it's more, it allows us to do way more than we could before, but we're still working very hard. So none of that is going to change. What I think it'll give us more yield out of the infrastructure that we have. So whereas, your 14-year-old son wasn't able to drive himself to hockey, now he can. So you do get some benefits. It will change our lifestyle to some degree, but in the end, it's not going to be the holy grail necessarily. What it will do, though, I'm pretty confident, is that it will, as a disruptive technology, it's going to really shake up the real estate market. And properties and pricing right now, the way they are, I think are going to start to move in very unpredictable ways, and that's going to be very good for some people and very bad for others. So I think anytime you have a disruptive technology, there's huge opportunity and there's huge risk for actors that don't move. So I think anybody in the real estate industry, if you can put a building up with no parking today, with no excavation, it completely changes your numbers if you can sell it. So, these are real things. And if you're looking at a development that has some of these huge projects have 5-8 year projections in terms of occupancy, we should start thinking about these things now.
Sure.
Time for one more question. Do you mind if I go to a question, just to John Campbell at the back here?
John Campbell, Waterfront Toronto. And one of the challenges, as Stuart mentioned, was this evolutionary process of it's going to not happen overnight, it's going to take some time. What we're trying to do in the waterfront is look at how do you prepare for the future, you have to build for tomorrow morning. So, for example, with parking garages, we're saying to our developers, you've got to build up for flat floors, and you've got to build minimum height so that structure has a 100-year life as opposed to a 20-year life. So the question to the panel is, as city builders, are there other things we should be looking at to prepare for the flexibility of the future? Think, for example, intersections. Should they be more wider to allow for a roundabout function for vehicle changes? What are those things we should be looking at today
Yes.
that allow us to have the flexibility for the future?
Excellent question.
I think that one of the things that is going to be an issue, and this goes back to the snowstorm and both questions together. The first electric cars were actually the first cars. They were electric. Daimler invented an electric car around the turn of the century. It lost a battle. One of the challenges that we're going to see as you start to say, okay, what should we put in roundabouts and things like that, we're going to have this hybrid environment for a period of time. And we can't even predict how long that would be. And the hybrid environment will actually, I think, be the crucible which will determine the success of the autonomous car. And so if we said put in roundabouts, well, I know in Kitchener-Waterloo there's a number of roundabouts. I've also driven around a lot in Europe, and I've seen people who clearly don't know what a roundabout is enter one. And it's pretty scary. And so I think that one of the challenges we're going to have, and this is the challenge that you probably have at Waterfront Toronto even, is how do you build the environment that actually acts as the harbinger for the autonomous car as opposed to the thing that makes autonomous cars impossible. So, let's say we have a weaker car that's lighter, and we've got somebody in their big SUV who doesn't know how to use a roundabout. those two things cannot come together without it being in the front page of the Toronto Star at least a couple days in a row. And that will have a huge impact on people's proclivity to purchase and interest in it. And that's a huge issue. And we've seen it before with Betamax and VHS. We've seen it with all sorts of technology.
Tony, I'll give you the last point because we unfortunately are out of time, but please.
I feel the pressure.
The pressure. Make it a good one.
Well,
Take us away.
I just feel that John's question is actually a fundamental one, right? And we've been designing for the car for so long that the temptation is now to start designing for the driverless car. And I think we need to design for people and let the driverless car catch up to that. But it would be a real shame if we start to design the waterfront or any other environment for a new technology as opposed to what we want, and then use technology to serve the waterfront-oriented designs that we want to generate.
Bravo.
John Perro and Jeremy, have I robbed you of a killer final
No,
point?
I think
Okay.
that was a perfect close.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I will then close it just about on time here. As I said right from the beginning, we're only able to really scratch the surface, and I think that most people only have. And I think that's interesting because, as I said, this is something that we're seeing eyes wide open come at us, unlike some other disruptive waves that have washed over us before we knew that it was even coming. So it's interesting to me, and I think it'll be something that you can expect ULI to keep a very close eye on over the coming months and years as a clearly an important force. How transformative, we'll find out. But clearly something that there's an appetite for more understanding for. So that closes out our final session, concurrent session. Very, very excited. I hope you've enjoyed all the sessions. I've really enjoyed those plenary sessions, and we promise you our last one, it will be great. And I think that it will live up to our first ones. So please stick around for another hour, and we'll see you in the main plenary session in about 8 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's okay.
That was fantastic. That's excellent.
Yeah, it's right here. Okay.
Oh, yeah, we're going to do it. Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Thank you. That was fantastic. That was great. Great.
Where are we going? There?
Wherever you want us. Where do you want us?
You're looking good, guys. Okay, big smiles right here. And one more. That's perfect. Thanks, gents. Thank you all again.